Welcome back to Sputnik. The rise of lobbyists and the increasing supremacy of money in politics has killed democracy in the United States, as we can see in real time right now. Less noticed is that the same thing is happening in Britain. One man who has noticed is author of Parliament Limited, Martin Williams, an investigative journalist of note, who joins us now. Martin, thanks. Tell us what you mean by Parliament Limited.
Well, it's called Parliament Limited because it seems to me that the focus of Westminster and British politics seems more and more to be on the focus of politicians, I should say, seems to more and more be on making money and business rather than representing people. So for the book, I did, I think the first time ever, an analysis of all the companies that are directed by MPs and by peers in the House of Lords. And the results are really quite staggering just because of the sheer numbers. So there's around 2,800 directorships, company directorships held by politicians, for about 2,500 companies. Now, just in terms of the actual numbers, they bring in a combined revenue of around £220 billion a year. £220 billion a year, and that is their employees. They've got they employ about as many people as it's roughly equivalent to 1 in 20 of the UK workforce. And now, obviously, as you know, MPs have to declare things. They have to. There's a public register of interests where they have to put all their directorships and outside jobs. But when I tallied this up to the register of interests, and it is impossible to do it exactly right. It's not an exact science, but roughly around 40% of these directorships were not declared. So now some of them are not controversial, some of them didn't necessarily need to be declared by the rules, but a lot of them did. And there are very clear examples in the book where, people really should have said something about their interests, and then they go and talk on the same subject that they've got a financial interest in without declaring it.
That's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
In fact, everything that you have just said, and I was in Parliament for almost 30 years, and everything you just said there was actually astounding. Give us an example of undeclared interest that's in your book.
Well, first of all, I'll give you an example of declared ones, right? Okay. Because even when they have declared them, it's still bad sometimes. So one of the big issues today, housing. We've got a housing crisis in Britain.
Yeah.
Now, for the public, generally, I think it's about 2% of the public are landlords. But in Parliament, it's 30% of MPs.
And as a proportion of Conservative MPs, any idea what it is?
It's in my book.
We'll have to buy it to find out. But
it's very high.
There's a majority of Conservative MPs are landlords. And £30 billion a year is paid out by the state in housing benefit to landlords, including oftentimes them.
Yes, exactly. Now, a lot of these MPs will declare it. A lot of them will say, I am a landlord. But the combined effect of these, so individually, they're not necessarily doing anything against the rules, but the combined effect of it is, in January of this year, there was a law proposed that would have made it illegal for landlords to fail to provide housing that was not fit for habitation, which you would have thought that's a pretty obvious thing, that we need landlords to have houses that are fit for habitation. That was blocked by MPs, including a gang of 72 MPs who were earning at least £10,000 a year each as a landlord.
It's unbelievable.
It's absolutely astounding. And, of course, as you rightly say, the register hides as much as it reveals.
Yes.
For example, there's a rather infamous MP in the news this week who has a multi-million-pound property empire. No one quite knows how they managed to build it up. And when one gigantic piece of real estate was revealed in the Daily Mail, the answer was, actually, it's my wife's property. So,
it's always the wife's property.
So the wives or husbands of parliamentarians can quite privately own. But then, of course, as any fool knoweth, a man and wife, as we are, our income is one. Our expenditures are one, at least in a common sense world. that would be the case. Or, in the same newspaper, this same week, a former minister is revealed to have given Wonga
Yes.
advance sight of a critical report of a select committee, and he's been suspended for 2 days.
Well, I can do better than that.
I'm beginning to believe that you can.
In my book, one of the people who I came across was Baroness Greenfield, who's a member of the House of Lords, and she made a speech in Parliament a couple of years ago where it was about higher education. Now, whatever you think of her politics and her views, her view in this case was that the government should help universities to open up to private investors more. Of course. They should open up to private investors more. And one of her main points was that when scientists or academics at universities have ideas and come up with concepts, the university will own the intellectual property rights for those ideas. And she was saying that it should be easier for private clients to, in effect, kind of get a piece of the intellectual property rights to kind of invest in intellectual property rights. And a month earlier, I think it was a month earlier, very soon before, she had just been made non-executive director of a company called Tech Capital Limited, whose actual slogan is helping clients profit from university intellectual capital. Now, I complained about Baroness Greenfield. I put a complaint in. And just a few weeks ago, this report came out by the House of Commons Committee for Privileges and Conduct. And this was after weeks of waiting for this to come out. It finally concluded that she had breached the Code of Conduct. She apologised. She said it was an accident. But her punishment, you think that's quite a serious breach. You would have thought maybe she'd be slapped with a fine, maybe she'll be kicked out of Parliament. No, her actual punishment was that she had to write a letter of apology to the chairman of a subcommittee. This report has been out on the internet for a few weeks, but the media is not interested. No one's reported it.
Once you're in the Lords, you're in it for the rest of your life.
Most of the people don't know.
And there are thousands of them. So, I mean, I've never heard of Baroness Brownfield or Greenfield.
Yeah.
Baron is not. I've never heard of her, and therefore my interest in what she's doing is less. But they're all members of the British Parliament.
Yes.
An even bigger problem than individual malfeasance from parliamentarians is and I saw this happen. It was not the case before I entered Parliament 30 years ago, but it very definitely is now. Big money, lobbyists swarming all over the place, often given a pass to swarm even where the public cannot go in the building by members of Parliament, lobbying for the revolving door between public life and private business, lobbying for the privatization of various services that the country used to provide. Mm-hmm. The rise of the lobbyist is an even bigger cancer than the rise of the rotten MP.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're always going to have rotten MPs, aren't we? Whatever we do, whatever rules we put in place, there's always going to be some people who we don't like. There's always, whether it's... I mean, I should point out that a lot of the MPs, including Baroness Greenfield, are not corrupt. They've not done anything illegal, but it's stuff that we look at it and we go, we don't like that. There's always going to be people like that. Yeah. There's always going to be people like that. But the influence of lobbying and big business is so corrosive to the democratic process. And it doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter if you're left-wing, right-wing, whatever. We deserve a proper democracy where big business doesn't influence it and our representatives actually represent us, the people, rather than big businesses.
But was it easy for you to investigate this? Were they secretive about this?
Well, if you want to look at, for instance, politicians with shareholdings in, let's say, BAE Systems, which is a listed...
I know all about that.
UK's biggest arms company, and it's a listed company. It's floating on a stock exchange. With private companies, with private limited companies, anyone can find out who the shareholders are of those companies. But with listed companies, it is pretty much impossible to identify whether a politician has shares in that company or not. In fact, as I've discovered, it's basically illegal. There's a very complicated law, the Companies Act 2006, and Section 116 of that Act states that in order to access the register of shareholders, you have to first of all provide that company with your name, your address, and also the name and address of anyone you might potentially want to share that information with. Now, I'm writing a book, or I wrote a book. That would mean that I would have to have given them the name and address of everyone who might ever potentially read my book.
And after this broadcast, that would be impossible because everyone's going to be queuing up to buy this book, which is really fantastic. Parliament Limited by Martin Williams. I promise you this will not be the last volume of this book.
No.
You're going to have to produce almost an annual of this subject because the problems that you've identified are not going away anytime soon.
Now, of course,
last word to you.
David Cameron has now resigned as an MP. What's he going to go on to do now? Almost certainly he'll do the same as Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and get some nice, cushy private sector jobs, make lots of money for himself.
Well, the front page of your book is pigs at a trough. Perhaps we should draw a veil over it there. Martin Williams, author of Parliament Limited. Thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.